This is the last support topic in chapter 2, and this has to do with absolute value. As you've noticed, should have noticed in the recent support topics, we are learning skills for numbers that, or for formulas that show up throughout statistics. So as you move through chapter 2 and then, of course, the rest of the semester, you will be seeing formulas and things that show up that involve square roots, absolute value, different things like that. So that's why the support topics are introduced here in chapter 2. First thing is absolute value. Most students recall that absolute value of a real number is always positive, with the exception of 0, which doesn't have a sign. And that is true. And that is typically how it's introduced at the junior high level. But you have to go beyond that to really understand what absolute value is. Absolute value is actually a distance. So absolute value represents the distance something is from 0. So whenever you're talking about a distance is always positive. You can't have a negative distance. So that's why the absolute value of a real number is always positive, because it's referring to a distance. So for any real number, the absolute value represents the distance from 0 on a number line. So therefore, if we look at -3, that would be 1, 2, 3 units from 0. If we look at +3, that's also 1, 2, 3 units from 0. So because of that, the absolute value of -3 is the same thing as the absolute value of +3, which is just 3. So either way, either direction you go, from -3 to 0 or from +3 to 0, both of those equal 3, because it is 3 units from -3 to 0, and it is 3 units from +3 to 0. So that's why the absolute value of -3 and the absolute value of +3 is 3. These two numbers, 3 and -3, are called opposites. And opposites are simply two numbers that are the same distance from 0 on the number line, and they have the same absolute value. One of them is to the left of 0, so therefore it has a negative on it. The other's to the right, so therefore it's positive. Opposites have opposite signs, and if you want the opposite of a number, you get it by multiplying by -1. So for example, the opposite of 2 would be -2. So the formal definition of absolute value is that the absolute value of x is equal to the number itself if the number is greater than equal to 0, which means positive or 0. And the absolute value of x is the opposite of x when x is less than 0 or negative. So the absolute value of a positive number is itself. The absolute value of a negative number is its opposite. So on these examples, the absolute value of positive 0.26 is itself positive 0.26. But the absolute value of negative 0.94 would be the opposite, or 0.94. So anytime you take the absolute value of a number, whether it's positive or negative, the result is always positive. On the next example, you'll notice there's a negative in front of the absolute value bars. So that negative is still there, and it's like having -1 times something, and then we're looking at the absolute value of -1.4, which is positive 1.4. So the negative gets just carried along, and then the absolute value of -1.4 is 1.4. So together, that would be -1.4. Here we're going to use our order of operations. We need to do the numerator, 4.7 minus 5.2 first. That's -0.5. Notice I still have the absolute value bars around it. And then the square root of 10 minus 9 is 1. Notice I still have my square root. Now when I take the absolute value of -0.5, it would be positive 0.5, and the square root of 1 is 1. And then 0.5 divided by 1 is 0.5. Now we have several examples here, just operations that involve square roots. So the first thing you want to do is simplify the square roots. The absolute value bars. Simplify the absolute value. So the 0.25 plus, when we take the square root of negative 0.25, it would also be positive 0.25. And then we add those together. 0.25 plus 0.25 would be 0.5. On this one, the negative 0.8 doesn't have bars around it, absolute value bars, so it just stays. The absolute value of 0.4 is 0.4 minus. The absolute value of negative 0.9 is 0.9. And then recall from an earlier section, when you have a minus a negative, that's a negative times a negative, that becomes a positive. So that would become plus 0.8. Notice here, I didn't make the negative and the negative and absolute value bars. It's only when it's a negative times a negative. So the absolute value bars are treated separately. And then we add these together. So when we add the negative 0.8 and the negative 0.9, we add our two negatives together. That would be negative 1.7. And then I add my positives together. 0.4 and 0.8 would be plus 1.2. And negative 1.7 and positive 1.2 would be negative 0.5. And you're welcome to use your calculator on the adding and subtracting part. That's not our main concern. Our concern is that you're doing the absolute value correct and that you're following the order of operations correctly. So here we have a negative, and then the absolute value of negative 0.75 is 0.75. The negative on the outside just gets carried along. And then this says times 0.6. So I'm going to leave the parentheses there for the times, and then times, and then the absolute value of negative 0.45 would be 0.45. So you would just do this multiplication. You can do it on your calculator. Negative 0.75 times 0.6 times 0.45 would be negative 0.2025. The next one, the negative outside just gets carried along. The absolute value of 0.21 is 0.21. The 0.14 gets carried down, divided by the absolute value of negative 0.7 is positive 0.7, times 5 minus the absolute value of 0.62 is 0.62. Now we're doing the order of operations here. We've taken care of our absolute value bars, which would kind of be like grouping symbols. Next, there's not any exponents, so we've got the p taken care of, the exponents taken care of because there's not any. Multiplication and division go together in order from left to right. So that means that this division would take place next. So I'd have negative 0.21 plus 0.14 divided by 0.7 would be 0.2. And then I'm going to bring down everything else, times 5 minus 0.62. Okay, I still have a multiplication, so I'm going to do the multiplication next. So negative 0.21 plus 0.2 times 5 would be 1, and then minus 0.62. So that takes care of the MD in our PEMDAS. And then addition and subtraction, and you just set from left to right, or you can combine the negatives if you want to, or just put this in your calculator. And negative 0.21 plus 1 minus 0.62 would be 0.17. And that takes care of the adding and subtracting. On this next one, we have the absolute value of negative 0.4, and then we're going to square it. So the first thing you do, absolute value of negative 0.4 is 0.4, and then 0.4 squared would be 0.16. Here we have the absolute or the square root of the absolute value. So we take the absolute value first. Absolute value of negative 1/4 is positive 1/4. When we take the square root of a fraction, we separate it. So we have the square root of 1 over the square root of 4. 1 times 1 is 1. 2 times 2 is 4. So the square root of 1 is 1. The square root of 4 is 2. And 1/2 would be my answer. And then we have a couple of formulas that involve absolute value. So on this one, it says find the sum of the absolute value of x. So what you want to do is you want to come here into the table and find the absolute value of each one of these first. So the absolute value of 0.1 is 0.1, of negative 0.4 is positive. Notice all I'm doing here is changing all of these to a positive. If it's positive, the absolute value stays positive. If it's negative, the absolute value changes to a positive. I want to find the sum of these, so that tells me I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to add all of these numbers together. So when I add these numbers together, I would get 2.9. And then on this last one, it's the absolute value of x minus 0.05. So that tells me the first thing I have to do is x minus 0.05. So I need to do that. So I'm going to create my table here. So I'm going to extend it, add another row to it, and right here I'm going to do x minus 0.05. So what I'm doing, and again, you can use your calculator to do this, you're taking the first x value, negative 0.03, and you're subtracting 0.05. So that would be negative 0.08, and then you're going to do 0.28 minus the 0.05. So 0.28 minus the 0.05 would be 0.23. And then you're just going to keep going down the row and doing that. So 0.34 minus 0.05 would be 0.29. And then the next one would be negative 0.62. And then negative 0.31, 0.74, and 0.13. Okay, after you've done that, it asks us to find the sum of those numbers, the sum of the absolute value of those numbers. So now I'm going to apply the absolute value to it. That's really easy to do because all you're doing when you apply the absolute value is change all of these to positives. So if it's positive, it stays the same. If it's negative, it becomes positive. And then it asks me to find the sum of those numbers. So I'm going to go back up here and I'm going to add these numbers together. So when I add all of those together and get the sum, it would be 2.4.